The hall didn't go silent because of the Queen's command. It went silent because of my answer. But a few minutes earlier I was crouched under a grav panel in the outer corridor, elbow deep in wiring that hummed like it had opinions about my life choices, reminding myself that this assignment was supposed to be simple. Fix the system, stay invisible, collect a paycheck, maybe find coffee that didn't taste like regret. The palace, however, had other plans, because the moment I stepped into the main hall, gravity itself seemed to straighten its posture, the air thinning into something sharper, more aware, like it was watching. The chamber stretched wide, easily the length of a football field, filled with figures who carried power the way most people carry phones. Casually, constantly, without needing to check if it was still there. Their armor curved like liquid metal, their voices low and precise. And at the center of it all sat Queen Seraphine, composed in a way that made stillness feel like authority rather than absence. She looked human until you noticed the ears, long, elegant, angled slightly forward as if listening to something no one else could hear. I kept my eyes down, because people like me were background noise in rooms like this, useful but forgettable, the kind of presence that made powerful people comfortable because it didn't challenge them. That was the plan, anyway, until the princess looked at me. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a glance that lasted a second too long, then two, then long enough that I started wondering if I had accidentally broken something again, which wouldn't have been new, but this felt different, like she wasn't looking at me so much as confirming something. I shifted slightly, pretending to check a diagnostic slate that absolutely did not need checking, and told myself to relax, that people didn't just single out random technicians in royal courts. That would be ridiculous. Then the council began discussing her marriage, names being presented, alliances weighed, candidates evaluated with the calm detachment of people who had never had to worry about being chosen or not chosen. Each name came with achievements, victories, bloodlines that sounded expensive, and each one was dismissed with a slight movement of the Queen's hand, efficient, final. The room adjusted with every decision, tension rising not in volume but in density, like pressure building behind a sealed door. I remember thinking this was above my pay grade by about 10 light years, and that I should probably leave before someone realized I was still here. Then Queen Seraphine spoke again, her voice quiet enough that the room leaned in to hear it, and said, "My daughter will marry a human." And for a moment, no one reacted because the sentence didn't fit into reality properly, like a line of code that refused to compile. Then the silence fractured, whispers spreading, disbelief moving through the hall in controlled waves, and I had just enough time to think, "That's unfortunate for whichever human she means," before her gaze shifted, precise and undeniable, and landed directly on me. There is a very specific kind of silence that happens when powerful people realize something is not under their control anymore. And I felt it start the second the Queen looked at me like I was not supposed to be standing where I was standing. For a moment, I honestly assumed she was looking past me, maybe at someone more important who had unfortunately aligned themselves with my general direction. So I did what any reasonable person would do in a room full of royalty and advanced alien architecture. I took a small step to the left. Her gaze followed me. That was when I knew this was not a coincidence. This was a problem. The council had gone quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now, sharper, more focused, like everyone had collectively decided to observe a situation that might become educational. Princess Lyra was still watching me, not with confusion, not even with curiosity anymore, but with something far more unsettling, recognition layered over restraint. Like she was holding back a reaction she did not have permission to show. I straightened slowly, mostly because staying crouched felt disrespectful, and also because my knees had decided this was a good time to remind me that I had been under a grav panel 5 minutes ago. Queen Seraphine rose, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the kind of controlled movement that made the entire room adjust around her, the air itself seeming to make space. Her attendants stepped back without being told, which was impressive and slightly terrifying. She walked toward me across the polished floor, each step measured, deliberate, and I had the distinct feeling that I was being evaluated in ways that had nothing to do with my job description. When she stopped in front of me, the difference in presence was immediate, like standing too close to something powerful and realizing you had misjudged the distance. Her eyes studied my face with quiet precision, not searching for identity, but confirming it. You, she said, and it was not a question. I considered several responses, including denial, confusion, and pretending to be a decorative object, but none of them felt appropriate. So I settled on honesty, which has historically been a risky strategy. That depends on what you need, I said, because if I was going to be pulled into something unreasonable, I preferred to at least sound cooperative. A faint shift passed through the court, subtle but noticeable, like a ripple across still water. Somewhere to my right, someone inhaled sharply. The queen's ears angled slightly forward, a detail I had learned meant interest, not irritation, which was encouraging in a very limited sense. You will answer when you are addressed, she said calmly, not unkindly, but with the kind of authority that did not require repetition. I nodded once, because arguing with that seemed like a poor long-term strategy. She turned slightly, enough for the entire hall to see both of us clearly, and I became aware of just how many people were watching, not just the council, but guards, advisors, individuals whose expressions ranged from disbelief to something closer to calculation. I had spent most of my life being ignored in rooms far less impressive than this one, and now, suddenly, I was the most interesting variable in a system that did not tolerate unpredictability. This is the one, Queen Seraphine said, and the statement landed with more weight than it had any right to, as if it connected to something larger than the conversation happening in the room. Princess Lyra stepped forward then, just slightly, enough to break the careful symmetry of the court, her eyes never leaving mine, and for the first time I noticed something else beneath that recognition, something steadier, like certainty. I opened my mouth to say something reasonable, something safe, something that would return me to the comfortable anonymity I had been enjoying 10 minutes ago, but before I could, the queen spoke again, her voice carrying easily across the hall. Answer, she said, and just like that, every possible outcome narrowed to a single moment I had absolutely not prepared for. There are moments when time does not slow down, it simply waits, and I could feel the entire hall waiting on me like a held breath that refused to be released until I gave it permission. I looked at the queen, then at Princess Lyra, and then briefly at the floor because it seemed like the only thing in the room not expecting something impossible from me. And I realized very quickly that there were only 3 acceptable answers in a situation like this: yes, no, or silence, and somehow all 3 felt equally dangerous. I exhaled slowly, buying myself a second that stretched just enough to think, and in that second something else surfaced, not a memory exactly, more like a pattern recognition my brain had been ignoring on purpose. The way the princess was looking at me, the way the queen had not asked who I was, only that I answer, the way the room felt less surprised by me and more surprised that I was here now. With respect, I said finally, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. I think you may have the wrong human, which was a reasonable statement, grounded, practical, the kind of thing that usually solved problems by redirecting them towards someone more qualified. A few heads in the court shifted, some in agreement, some in anticipation, as if they had expected that answer and were waiting to see how it would be dismantled. Queen Seraphine did not react immediately, which was worse than if she had. She studied me with the same calm precision, her expression unchanged, her posture effortless, and then, very slightly, she tilted her head, not in confusion, but in acknowledgement. No, she said, and the word carried a quiet certainty that made my reasonable statement feel less like a solution and more like a misunderstanding. We do not, she continued, and that was when the silence deepened, not outwardly, but inwardly, like the room had shifted from observing to confirming. Princess Lyra took another step forward, closing a distance I had not realized was being measured, and now she stood close enough that I could see the fine details, the controlled tension in her posture, the way her breathing was steady but deliberate, like she was holding something back with discipline rather than fear. You do not remember, she said softly, not accusing, not disappointed, just stating a fact that carried more weight than it should have. I blinked once, because that sentence did not belong to me, not in any way that made sense, and yet, something about it felt uncomfortably familiar, like hearing a song you had forgotten but still knew the rhythm of. I think I would remember something like this. I replied carefully, because honesty was still my default setting even when it was inconvenient. and a faint shift crossed her expression, not quite a smile, not quite relief, but something that suggested I had confirmed a variable she was tracking. Around us, the court remained perfectly still, but I could feel the attention, tightening, focusing, as if the outcome of this conversation had suddenly become more important than whatever political discussion had been happening before I walked in with a toolkit and low expectations. Queen Seraphine's gaze moved between us, measuring, calculating, and then she spoke again, quieter this time, but somehow even more final. "Then answer properly," she said, and I understood, with a clarity that arrived a second too late to be helpful, that this was not a question about willingness or agreement or even marriage. This was a test of something I did not fully understand yet, something tied to a past I did not remember, but everyone else in the room seemed to recognize, and for the first time since I walked into the hall, I had the distinct and uncomfortable feeling that I was the only one missing information about my own life. It is a strange experience to realize that everyone else in the room understands something about you that you do not, and the longer I stood there under the weight of their attention, the more that realization settled in like a quiet but persistent problem that refused to be ignored. I looked at Princess Lyra again, really looked this time, and there was nothing accidental in the way she was watching me, no confusion, no hesitation, just a steady, searching certainty that made me feel like I had already given an answer without knowing it properly. I repeated, more to myself than to the queen, because that word carried expectations I had not agreed to and standards I did not fully understand, and yet something in me responded to it instinctively, like muscle memory that had been waiting for the right moment to wake up. I straightened slightly, not because anyone told me to, but because it suddenly felt incorrect not to, and that alone was enough to make me pause internally. Because I had spent most of my life avoiding attention, not stepping into it. The hall remained perfectly still, not a single unnecessary movement. Even the ambient systems seemed to quiet themselves, like the architecture had decided this moment was worth listening to. "If this is about a decision," I said slowly, choosing each word with care, "then I would need to understand the terms before I give you an answer," which was reasonable, grounded, exactly the kind of response someone like me would give when cornered into something official and irreversible. A few of the advisors shifted almost imperceptibly, as if reassessing the situation, and I caught the faintest hint of approval from somewhere in the room, though it vanished too quickly to identify. Queen Seraphine, however, did not move at all, her gaze steady, her expression composed in a way that suggested my answer had not surprised her in the slightest. "You already understand the terms," she said, and there was no accusation in her voice, only quiet certainty, which somehow made it worse. I opened my mouth to argue, to explain that I clearly did not understand anything about this situation, but the words did not come out the way I expected. Instead, something else surfaced, something quieter, more precise, and far less comfortable. "If I did," I said, hearing the shift in my own tone as it settled into something steadier, "then I would also understand why you chose me." And the moment the sentence left my mouth, I felt it land in the room like a key turning in a lock. Princess Lyra's breath caught, subtle but unmistakable, and her eyes sharpened, not in surprise, but in confirmation. Around us, the silence changed again, no longer just observation, but recognition beginning to take shape. The queen's ears angled forward slightly, a detail so small it would have been invisible to most, but it carried weight here, meaning, intent. "Say it," she said softly, and that was when I realized this was not about giving an answer. It was about giving the right answer, the one that matched. Something already decided, something already known. I felt a flicker of something at the edge of my awareness then, not a full memory, just fragments, a voice, a promise, the sense of standing in a place that looked nothing like this but felt exactly the same. I did not understand it, but I understood enough. I looked directly at Princess Lyra, meeting her gaze without hesitation this time, and for a brief second, the rest of the hall seemed to fall away, leaving only the space between us and whatever history I had somehow forgotten. "If I am the one you chose," I said quietly, "then there was a reason for it long before today." And the reaction was immediate, not loud, not chaotic, but absolute. The kind of stillness that does not come from uncertainty, but from something falling perfectly into place. The shift in the room was subtle, but it was there, the kind of change that did not announce itself with noise, but with absence, like something that had been resisting a conclusion finally deciding to let go. I could feel it in the way the court stopped evaluating me and started recalibrating, like I had moved from an unknown variable to a confirmed one, and that was significantly more concerning. Princess Lyra did not look away, not even for a second, and now there was no restraint in her expression, only quiet certainty layered over something deeper, something older than the moment we were standing in. "You said that before," she murmured, her voice low enough that it should not have carried, and yet somehow every person in the hall heard it, or at least felt it. I frowned slightly, not out of disagreement, but because the statement landed too close to something I could not quite reach, like a memory just out of focus. If I did, I replied carefully, I would probably remember the context, which sounded reasonable, grounded, and entirely insufficient the moment it left my mouth. A faint reaction moved through the advisors, not dismissal, not skepticism, but something closer to anticipation, as if they were waiting for the next piece to fall into place. Queen Seraphine stepped closer then, closing the last remaining distance with a calm precision that made it clear this was not improvisation, this was alignment. She studied me again, not searching, not questioning, but confirming details she already knew. And for the first time I noticed something else in her gaze, not authority, not expectation, but recognition that carried a weight I could not explain. "Memory is not always a requirement for truth," she said, her voice steady, almost gentle in a way that felt far more dangerous than anything sharp or forceful. I let that settle for a second, because arguing philosophy with a queen in front of her entire court seemed like a losing strategy, and also because a small, inconvenient part of me understood exactly what she meant. The problem was not that I disagreed. The problem was that something in me agreed too quickly. I glanced down at my hands, still marked faintly with grease from the grav panel. A reminder of the life I had been living up until 5 minutes ago. A life that did not include royal halls, alien queens, or conversations about forgotten promises. And yet, standing here, that version of reality felt thinner than it should have, like a cover story that had been convincing right up until it was not. "If there is something you expect me to confirm," I said slowly, lifting my gaze back to hers, "then you are asking me to recognize something I do not remember choosing." And the moment the words settled, I felt the shift again, sharper this time, like a line being drawn between what I knew and what I was about to know. Princess Lyra took another step, close enough now that the distance between us was no longer formal, no longer ceremonial, and the court did not move to stop her, which meant this was allowed, expected. "Even, you did choose," she said, and there was no doubt in her voice, no hesitation, only quiet certainty that made my lack of memory feel less like a gap and more like a delay. I held her gaze, searching for any sign that this was misunderstanding, exaggeration, anything that would return this situation to something manageable, but there was nothing like that there. Only the steady presence of someone who had been waiting for this moment far longer than I had been aware it existed. "Then I chose for a reason," I said, more to test the logic than to agree with it. But the reaction was immediate, not from the queen, not from the court, but from Lyra herself, a subtle shift in her posture, a quiet release of tension, like something had just aligned exactly the way it was supposed to. And that was when I realized, with a clarity that arrived too late to prevent it, that whatever answer they were waiting for, I had already started giving it without fully understanding what it meant. There is a point where uncertainty stops being an option and starts becoming a decision, and I could feel that point approaching whether I was ready for it or not. Like a door slowly closing behind me, without asking for permission, Princess Lyra did not move back, did not look away, and the closer she stood, the harder it became to treat this like a misunderstanding or a coincidence, because nothing about her reaction was uncertain. It was precise, controlled, and deeply personal in a way that did not belong to first meetings. I became aware of my own breathing then, steady but deliberate, as if my body had already decided that whatever came next required more attention than I had been giving it. "Then say it," the queen said again, softer now, but with a finality that removed every remaining excuse. And I understood that this was not about guessing correctly. It was about recognizing something that was already true whether I acknowledged it or not. I hesitated, not because I wanted to refuse, but because I did not yet understand the shape of what I was agreeing to. And that hesitation was enough to trigger something unexpected, not in the room, but in me. A flicker of sensation, not visual, not fully formed, more like a shift in perspective, as if my mind had just adjusted focus on something it had been ignoring. I saw a corridor, not this one, narrower, dimmer, the kind of place built for function rather than ceremony. And there was someone standing in front of me, smaller, younger, looking up with the same eyes that were now fixed on mine. The image was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind only the impression of it and the uncomfortable certainty that it had not been imagined. I exhaled slowly, grounding myself back in the present, aware now that the silence in the hall had deepened into something almost reverent, as if everyone else had been waiting for that moment even if they could not see it happen. If I said it before, I began carefully, my voice quieter now but steadier. Then I did not say it lightly. And the reaction was immediate, not loud, not visible to most. But I felt it in the way the air seemed to settle, like a system recognizing. A valid input. Princess Lyra's expression softened by a fraction, not enough to be called emotion, but enough to confirm that I was moving in the right direction. You did not, she said, and there was something in her tone now that had not been there before, not authority, not expectation, but trust, restrained and deliberate, like something she had chosen to hold onto despite uncertainty. I nodded once, more to myself than to her, because the logic was starting to form whether I wanted it to or not. And if I had made a promise, if I had chosen something that mattered enough to echo like this, then there had been a reason, something I believed in strongly enough to commit to even without understanding the consequences. I met her gaze fully then, no hesitation left, because hesitation no longer made sense in a situation that was clearly built on something I had already done. Then I would not break it, I said, and the words felt heavier than they should have, like they connected to something larger than the moment we were standing in, something that had been waiting for this exact confirmation. The effect was immediate and absolute, the kind of silence that does not come from shock, but from recognition finally reaching completion. And for the first time since I stepped into the hall, I understood that whatever answer they had been waiting for, this was it. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling over the hall like something deliberate, something chosen. And for the first time I understood that this was not the kind of moment people interrupted, it was the kind they witnessed. No one spoke, no one moved. Even the subtle background hum of the palace system seemed to lower itself, as if the architecture had decided this answer mattered more than anything else currently happening in the empire. Queen Seraphine watched me with that same steady focus. But now there was something else in it, something almost imperceptible, like a conclusion she had already reached quietly confirming itself in real time. Princess Lyra did not look surprised, not even slightly, and that was the part that unsettled me the most, because surprise would have made this easier to dismiss as coincidence. But this was not coincidence. This was recognition completing itself. I became aware then of how still I was standing, how every instinct I had to step back, to deflect, to return to the safe anonymity of being overlooked, had simply stopped applying, as if they belonged to a different version of me that was no longer relevant in this room. A shift moved through the court, subtle but unmistakable, not resistance, not protest, but adjustment, like an entire system recalibrating around a new center point. And I realized that whatever I had just said had not only answered the queen, it had changed the structure of the conversation entirely. One of the advisors, positioned several feet to the left, opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again without a word, and that small, almost invisible hesitation carried more weight than any formal objection could have. Queen Seraphine turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge the presence of the court without breaking the line of focus between us. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, but no longer testing. "Then it is acknowledged," she said, and the phrasing was precise, not a proposal, not a suggestion, but a formal recognition of something already established. The words settled into the room with quiet finality, and I felt the shift again, sharper now, like a line being drawn not just around me, but through me. separating who I had been from whatever I was about to become. Princess Lyra took one final step forward, closing the last of the distance. And now there was nothing ceremonial left between us. No space for interpretation or distance, only the reality of two people, standing in a moment that had clearly been waiting for us longer than I had been aware of it. Her voice, when she spoke, was softer than before, but carried further, not because of volume, but because of certainty. "You always said you would stay," she said, and that word, always, landed with a weight that bypassed logic entirely and went straight to that same place inside me where the earlier fragments had come from. I frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but because the statement felt correct in a way I could not justify, like a truth I had accepted without remembering when or why. "Then I suppose I should start acting like I meant it," I replied, and the dry edge in my tone was automatic, familiar, the last piece of myself that still felt entirely under my control, and it earned a reaction I had not expected. A faint, almost imperceptible shift at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough to register. Around us, the silence held, but it was no longer empty. It was full, charged with something that had moved past uncertainty into something far more stable, far more irreversible. And somewhere in the back of my mind, beneath the surface of everything I thought I knew about myself, a quiet realization began to take shape, not fully formed yet, but undeniable in its direction, that whatever promise I had just reaffirmed, it was not new, it was not spontaneous, it was something I had made long ago, in a place I did not remember, to a person who had clearly never forgotten. The acknowledgement did not echo, it settled, and that was somehow heavier, like the entire hall had accepted something without needing to repeat it, and now it was simply adjusting to a reality that had shifted without asking for permission. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, aware that I had just agreed to something that clearly meant more to everyone else than it did to me. And that imbalance was starting to feel less like confusion and more like a missing piece I was expected to find. Queen Seraphine turned fully toward the court then, her posture unchanged, her presence as controlled as ever, but the atmosphere followed her movement like it understood the hierarchy better than I did. "Prepare the formal record," she said, and the command moved through the room instantly, silent confirmations passing between advisors, systems activating without visible input. The entire structure of the palace responding as if it had been waiting for this instruction. I blinked once, because that sounded permanent in a way I had not yet processed, and I opened my mouth to say something practical, something like we should probably clarify details before recording anything irreversible. But before I could, Princess Lyra spoke again, and her voice carried differently now, not louder, but closer, as if it belonged to the space between us rather than the room around us. "You still question it," she said, not accusing, just observing, and I considered denying it out of reflex. But that felt pointless given the circumstances. "I question most things," I replied, which was both honest and, at this point, insufficient. Her expression shifted slightly, not away from certainty, but towards something more measured, like she was adjusting her expectations to match my current state rather than the one she remembered. "You always did," she said, and there was something almost reassuring in that, like whatever version of me she knew had not been entirely different from the one standing here now. I exhaled slowly, glancing briefly around the hall, taking in the scale of everything again, the distance to the far walls, easily over 100 feet, the height of the ceiling, the way the light moved in controlled gradients like it was being directed rather than emitted, and it struck me that none of this felt as foreign as it should have. Unfamiliar, yes, but not impossible, not overwhelming. More like returning to a place I had only visited once and somehow remembered how to navigate. "If this is going to be recorded," I said, bringing my attention back to the Queen, "then I would like to understand one thing first." And that earned a pause, not resistance, but acknowledgement, the kind given to someone whose input now carried weight. "Ask," Queen Seraphine said, and the simplicity of it made the moment feel more balanced than it had any right to. I nodded once, choosing the question carefully, not because I was afraid of the answer, but because I had the distinct feeling it would matter more than I was ready for. "Why me?" I said, and the words were straightforward, But the silence that followed them was not. It deepened again, not with uncertainty, but with something closer to anticipation, like I had just reached the point in the conversation everyone else had been waiting for. Princess Lyra did not hesitate this time, did not look to. The queen did not defer in any way. She simply met my gaze with that same steady certainty and answered. "Because you are the only one who did not leave," she said, and the sentence landed with a clarity that bypassed logic and went straight to that same place inside me that had been stirring since this began, and for a brief second, the fragments returned, stronger this time. A corridor, a promise, a voice saying stay, and my own voice answering without hesitation, and then it was gone again, leaving behind one undeniable conclusion, that whatever this was, whatever I had just stepped into, it had started long before I remembered, and it had never really ended. The words did not echo, but they did not need to, because they settled into something deeper than sound, something that connected directly to that same place inside me that had been responding all along without waiting for permission. I did not look away from Princess Lyra, not this time, because the moment she said it, something shifted again, not just a fragment, not just a flicker, but a pattern forming with enough clarity to feel intentional. A corridor, narrow, functional, dim light reflecting off metal surfaces, the kind of place built to be passed through, not remembered. And yet it was there, anchored in my mind like it had never left. A younger version of her stood in front of me, smaller, unguarded in a way that the woman standing before me now was not. And there was fear in that memory, not overwhelming, but real, the kind of fear that made people reach for certainty even if they did not fully understand it. And I heard it, not perfectly, not completely, but enough, her voice asking a question that felt too large for the space it was spoken in, asking if I would stay. I exhaled slowly in the present, grounding myself in the hall again. But the weight of that moment did not fade this time. It remained, not as a memory I could explain, but as a truth I could not deny. "You remember," Lyra said quietly, and this time it was not a question of whether I did or did not. It was a recognition that something had reached me. I shook my head slightly, not in refusal, but in precision, because that mattered. "Now, not everything," I said, and my voice carried differently than before, less uncertain, more aligned with something I had not realized I was holding. "But enough," I added, and that was the part that changed the room again. Queen Seraphine watched closely, not interrupting, not guiding, simply observing the moment complete itself in its own time, and for the first time since this began, I understood that she had never needed to convince me of anything. She had only needed to wait. I shifted my weight slightly, the motion small but deliberate, because it no longer felt like I was standing in the wrong place. It felt like I had finally reached the place I was supposed to be, even if I did not. "Remember how I got there? If I stayed then," I said, meeting Lyra's gaze fully. It was not because I was told to, and that mattered. I could feel that it mattered, not just to me, but to her, to the queen, to the entire structure of what was happening. It was because I chose to. I continued, and the words carried a steadiness that did not come from confidence, but from alignment, from something settling into place exactly where it belonged. Lyra's expression softened again, just slightly. But this time there was no restraint in it, no need to hold anything back, because whatever doubt had been present was no longer relevant. "And you still would," she said, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as a statement she already believed. I let that sit for a second, not because I needed time to decide, but because I needed to recognize that the decision had already been made, long before this moment, long before this hall, long before I understood what any of it meant. I nodded once. Simple, direct, no hesitation left to justify or explain. "Yes," I said, and the word did not feel like an answer. It felt like a continuation. The hall remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of shock or uncertainty. It was the silence of acknowledgement, of a system that had reached the conclusion it was always moving toward. Queen Seraphine inclined her head slightly, not in approval, not in surprise, but in recognition, as if a final piece had settled into place. "Then it begins," she said, and the words carried forward, not as an ending, but as the opening of something that had been waiting for far longer than I had been aware, something that now, finally, had no reason to wait any longer.